It's beliefs about thinking. For maybe the most common one is the belief that worry is helpful. Now that sounds like do we really have that belief? But if you're somebody that worries a lot, like myself, uh, then clearly I must have a belief that this is a good thing. The more I worry, I'll find a solution. Like there's some benefit in worrying. Otherwise, why would I do it? Why would I do it? So that's a sort of metacognitive belief. And then metacognitive therapy has got this thing, what's called attentional something syndrome. I can't remember the terminology now, but they've identified this sort of common sort of system in a way that's part of rumination, and rumination, sort of excessive, repetitive rumination, which we've all experienced in times of great distress. That's sort of intrusive. You can't control it. It just sort of repeats itself over and over in your head as a sort of central factor in a lot of disorders. So anyway, to cut a long story short, metacognitive therapy or metacognitive approaches focus on identifying these metacognitive beliefs and then also developing techniques to stop that rumination. They've got a thing called attentional training, something like that, where you teach yourself how to shift your focus away from this rumination, to get a distance from that, instead of just focusing on actual thoughts.
So bring it back to addiction and how that might be helpful in someone's recovery. So, for example,
Yeah.
I've been working all day and then I start obsessing about, fuck, I can't wait to get to the pub after work. I
Yeah.
can't wait to get out. I can't, and you kind of get hijacked by that.
Yeah. Well, I'll sort of maybe explain it in the way that we present it in the book using a sort of metacognitive approach. So in the book, the sort of central theory of MEB is there's a thing called the I system, which is a sort of a heuristic for a lot of processes. I system, the functioning, which is basically an excessive focus on self and rumination. Particularly when things don't go your way, there's sort of an exaggerated self-obsession and rumination that sort of hijacks one's functioning to some extent, which I think we've all experienced. Somebody says something negative about you, and then it just it just boils for days and weeks or something.
I'm familiar with that.
I'm sure you all are. So that's one example of that. So what we've done in the book is correlate that. Let's call it rumination, sort of self-rumination, like a type of self-obsessed rumination, as a central dynamic within addiction. But I've called it in the book, I call it addicted mode. So basically what the book focuses on isn't so much thinking. It's like a mode, like a type of state you go into, like a mode of being from an existential point of view. And that mode, which I'll call addiction mode or addiction mode of being, is a mode that you can go into that we argue underlies all addictive behavior. And that mode is a type of fantasy, obsessive state that is also a contraction of awareness that becomes quite sort of tunnel vision, and that particularly focuses on the reward of using as opposed to the whole picture. So it's a contracted mode with heightened cravings, heightened distorted thinking, heightened fantasy, heightened rumination and obsession with the drug or using whatever, it could also be other things that leads to that. And simply put, we argue that it's a sort of a contracted state, but it's a state that you can also get out of. It's not a chronic thing. Where we would argue is that addiction as the actual disorder that one can observe is a chronic, contracted, addicted mode state where eventually you're entirely hijacked by that state and you just virtually, late stage, Late stage addict is somebody that's entirely hijacked by that state and is just there all
And
the
they're
time.
living there.
You're just there. If you're an addict, which you're going to be there by default. You're just focused on getting the next hit. There's no expansion or getting back to a normal type of function. Where let's
It's a
say,
great place to be. Gives you
yeah,
meaning and purpose and direction, and you
yeah,
don't have to worry about anything. It's just like, okay, it's a macabre form of meditation and
yeah, it
living.
is. It's That's why I say mindfulness is a bit overrated, because if you want to see a Zen monk mindful person, watch somebody load a rock on a crack pipe. And nobody is
Yeah.
more mindful and in the moment than that dude. So, is mindfulness by default just a good thing? It's more what you're mindful of, than just being mindful. But anyway, um, so
Have you got a
where
parrot in the background or something?
yeah, is making a noise.
I can hear him running in the cage.
Oh,
It's all
is
right.
it? Yeah. Let me just move it. I'll keep it in the office, otherwise it starts screeching. But anyway,
As long as you're not like Skinner and started to put your children in boxes.
yeah, I'm busy doing operant conditioning on my parrot. Yeah, so basically, somebody, let's say that's a sort of weekend warrior coke user, but still problematic, can get by the whole week without necessarily being in that addicted mode. And then when it's Friday afternoon, it's like, and goes on a binge. So basically, what we what we argue is that sort of addicted mode is a very large
So
component.
you're working with practitioners that are going to kind of help do an intervention in that pattern.
Yeah, well, the sort of the entire methodology of the book is very simple. It's developing practices that can help people that's already in recovery. It's not this methodology is not for people that's in full blown active addiction, because it would be pointless. It's a relapse prevention thing. Uh, I'm not a big
So
believer in psychological interventions for people that's in the grips of addiction.
yeah,
It's like
okay. So
it's a
somebody
no-win.
goes into treatment. Yeah, detox, primary care, secondary care. You start to bring it in. Tertiary
Yeah,
care.
I would
What's
say
like?
post sort of working through step one, post the denial stuff, where somebody has actually already experienced a more open state, and the sort of contracted addicted mode state becomes quite apparent, that you can sort of yourself phenomenologically experience when you get into that mode. um, um, and the aim is to help people recognize that sort of addictive mode, and then address it before that addictive mode turns into behavior. Not necessarily using immediately, but sort of dysfunctional behavior that can lead to using, sort of Patrick Kahn's like double circle thing, sort of block it before it gets there. Um, so what's different about this relapse prevention program is that it's actually not a relapse prevention program. It is, but it's a program that's designed to support your existing program and designed to support particularly 12-step practices. So it's a type of meta therapy, in the sense that it's not a therapy in it of itself. It's a therapy that's designed to enhance existing therapy. So the book we've done isn't meant to be a complete relapse prevention program, because that stuff has been done well. Why reinvent the wheel? There are very good programs out there that's comprehensive, that deals with all that stuff. So this is sort of like taking steroids, recovery steroids. It's like an extra boost for your recovery. So it brings in a different perspective of like who is doing your recovery. Not so much what you're doing and how you're doing it, which is the typical focus of relapse prevention. Do this, do that. How do I do it? Do this, do that. This is like who's in charge of that process. Is it your addicted mode, or is it sort of more, we call it more natural functioning mode? Because just because you're sitting in a meeting doesn't mean uh, it's helping. You can sit in a meeting with a really crappy attitude and a sort of a crappy way of being, and then it's not
Yeah,
helpful. So
I've moved so far away from 12-step stuff.
yeah,
It's yeah, and that kind of seems very kind of transactional. And the more kind of meetings you go to, the more clean time you get, the weller you're meant to be. I've met
yeah,
some very unwell people. In fact, I think people kind of get well once they kind of stop going to the meetings.
yeah. Well, I'll certainly
Certainly
get.
as much. Sorry, yeah, I'm very interested in your views here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think 12 steps has got a lifetime as well. That I personally think it can actually become counterproductive when you clean for a long time. Uh, um, Not for everyone, but yeah, that's all different, conversation. So this approach isn't 12 steps as such. It's just that it can support you if you're in a 12-step process, or if you're not in a 12-step process, it doesn't really matter what process you're in. So yeah, it's just very simple. It helps people get out of that addicted mode that precedes a relapse, because you don't just go and score heroin out of the blue without something going on. And also, particularly if you're in recovery, how do you get to a point where you forget all the consequences, forget everything that's happened, and convince yourself that it's a good idea? It's a form of self-deception, acrasia. So this helps people to get out of that sort of self-deceptive mode, which we, particularly in the clinical manual, say that it's a contracted self state of limited complexity. So in that addicted mode, using seems like a rational option, because it is a rational option. If you take out the context, like, I'm in that mode, I'm feeling bad, I want to feel better, drugs will make it better. Now that's a rational argument. Yes, it will. Drugs will make it better. I'll feel fantastic. Perfectly rational argument. But that's in a limited logic and a limited context. As soon as you open the context, oh, there's also consequences. Oh, it also costs money. Oh, it will also do that. Oh, it will also do that. Then it becomes more irrational. But within a contracted self state and with limited context, it's entirely rational response to whatever problem it is. So the problem isn't necessarily the thinking or whatever. The problem is the state you're in that precedes a relapse. And so, in short, the whole program is to help people recognize that state and then move out of that state so they can just function at whatever capacity they function at that moment, with their recovery, late recovery, or whatever.
How can we apply this thinking to the kind of the communities and the environments people go back into?
Yeah, well,
That's a big question. There was a big sigh. It was like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah, just thinking about it. Well, I think one's state, the type of state that you're in, is correlated a lot with your environment. So let's say I'm sitting on my veranda watching the sunset. That environment is more conducive to a more expanded sort of point of view, what I sort of want to call sort of a bird's eye view. And then the chance that I'm just going to make some insanely irrational decision in that state is more unlikely. But if I'm in certain environments that contracts my sort of state, or causes excessive stress or whatever, and creates that contracted sort of perspective, then that would make you more prone to going into one's addicted mode. And that once you're in addicted mode, you're more prone to moving further down that road, which using then becomes a rational response to that particular way of being. It's very similar to somebody that's in rage, like that mode can be rage as well. People that have got a rage problem or anger problem, their sort of mode that they're very prone. Addicts, the way I see it is that for addicts, their pathological mode is particularly drugs, but if you suffer from depression or rage, whatever, that's your thing, that you contract into. And if you're in rage, then it seems like an entirely rational response to fuck someone up that's giving you grief. It just seems perfectly sane and rational because you're incapable of seeing the bigger context. So I would say that one's environment is important, and also that's why I've become more into applying philosophy in the context of recovery, that what you read and the type of stuff you surround yourself by is conducive to more expanded thinking, like fuller context. And I feel that as a sort of state, I can feel when I'm in a contracted state, and I can feel when I'm in a more expanded state from a thinking point of view, or my environment. So I think, answer your question, that I think the environments that help you and the people around you that help you to be in a more sort of open state with higher complexity is a prophylactic against using. And anything that keeps you contracted with limited complexity would be a risk factor.
Here's the thing from a treatment point of view. Okay, so in the European context, people are going over to our clinic in South Africa for treatment because there's waiting lists in Europe. Yeah. They come to South Africa, they do very well in the foundation. There's a lovely program, there's structure, it's just a very nice, nurturing, expansive environment for recovery. Yeah. They then go back into their environment. Yep. And we try and we carry on the same program. So the exact same program that they're running at the clinic, they then do back on a daily basis where they are in their environments back in the Netherlands. Yep. And we're looking at kind of recovery process being a kind of a year long, that we're holding someone in this.
Yeah.
And we work with the individual and the family members as well, and the therapeutic team. So just to really try and have a kind of a systemic lens where we're walking with this person, and then they're connecting to people that kind of have lived experience, and there's identification, all that sort of stuff. But really what I'm trying to push across is the spirit of Ubuntu and community and that sort of stuff, and to move away from an American-centric 12-step disease model, DSM, that sort of. I'm really trying to move away from 12 steps, smart recovery. Like that works, but I'm more interested in an African solution to this.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I was recently chatting. I've been involved with the sort of philosophical counseling and the notion of philosophy as a way of life. And in fact, I'm doing my dissertation on the notion of philosophy as a way of life, and maybe surprisingly to some, applying Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy as a theory of addiction. I'm writing a dissertation about what does a Nietzschean model of addiction look like. And
oh wow, this sounds interesting.
Yeah, which sounds strange to some, and also argue that Nietzsche is the godfather of the 12 steps, which some might find even a bit odd. Through William James's pragmatism and all that stuff. But anyway, so I argue that addiction is a philosophical problem in need of a philosophical cure, which also seems odd, but there's a reason for that. But to cut the long story short, I've been talking to some guys that apply an African approach to philosophical counseling, and what a sort of African worldview will bring to the notion of philosophy as a way of life, which I think is very useful for recovery, because I think recovery is fundamentally a philosophy as a way of life. It's finding a new philosophically oriented life where you align yourself with a new worldview and different virtues or principles, whatever, so that you you exist differently in the world. And that's why I'm very anti the brain disease model, because it doesn't make any sense. Like saying, trying to explain addiction at a neurobiological level is like trying to say that amoeba has got mother issues and I'm going to, like, resolve the issues. Addiction doesn't exist on a molecular level. It's a much more complex phenomena of being in the world, and a relational phenomenon and a cultural, it exists, doesn't exist in there. It exists in, from an ontological scope. It's a very broad phenomena. And also doesn't explain why people do well in recovery and then they relapse when they go home. If they had a brain disease, they would relapse in recovery because their brain doesn't get fixed in recovery, and then it's all of a sudden diseased again by the time they get home. And also doesn't explain why people binge on weekends, but in the week they don't binge. Doesn't explain powerlessness and loss of control and up and down control. So it's a very outdated construct, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, a lot of these guys bring the notion of Ubuntu, and what that means as far as identity goes, that I am because we are. And the American approach, this whole self-actualization thing, which I don't have much time for, because you first need to be clear on who the self is. What is the so-called self that you're actualizing? And actualizing it towards what, and I just see that as another form of addiction, actually, and that's part of my argument in the dissertation, by bringing Nietzsche's notion of a true world, which was his critique of religions, and particularly Christianity as such, was the fact that it's an addiction to a fantasy. So the argument that I make is that addiction isn't about the drug or the effect of the pharmacology on the brain. It's addiction to the fantasy that the drug provides. So you're not addicted to crack, you're addicted to the state, the fantasy state that crack provides you in that 40 seconds where you feel like the most powerful person. And that's a fantasy. So the real addictive quality is the fantasy. And that's what you crave, is you crave the fantasy state that the pharmacological action provides. And it's that fantasy that's addictive. And that fantasy can be provided through many things. Sex addiction is mostly a fantasy. Gambling, you're not even taking anything, creates fantasy. And ideology, ideas, which for me is the biggest addiction, has always been the biggest addiction in the world, what I call ideology addiction. In fact, it's more, the fantasy state of ideas is more powerful than any drug we've invented yet. People have killed their children and have, sacrificed their children or committed suicide with their children in cults and religion. But even a crack addict won't just kill their own kids for no reason. You know what I mean? Or and what's the underlying thing? The underlying is fantasy. That's why they're capable of doing horrendous shit under that spell of fantasy. And that fantasy is utopia. It's always utopia. It's not fantasy of the worst thing. It's fantasy of utopia. So my argument is that addiction is fundamentally a fantasy, an addiction to the fantasy of utopia, whether it's political, whether it's drugs, whether it's gambling, whether it's sex, whatever. And recovery is a relinquishing of the fantasy of utopia. And that sort of ties in with the 12 steps. That's why I think the 12 steps is very useful, because it's a drug in and of itself. That's why it works. So you replace the fantasy of addiction with a fantasy of utopia and the 12 steps. All the promises, one day all my problems will disappear, I'll be spiritual, I'll choose my own higher power. It's quite a narcissistic thing if you think about it. I can choose my own
It's
higher
very
power.
narcissistic. It's very...
It's quite far out,
It's proper.
And that's why it works, is because and it works very well, so I'm not anti it, because I see this as sort of a pharmacon, like the Greeks said, pharmacon can be poison or cure. It's the same thing. So 12 steps and that early recovery stuff is sort of a new pharmacon that's more curative. You exchange the fantasy of the utopia of addiction for the fantasy of the utopia of the spiritual person, self-actualizing person, or whatever it is, which I think has got a limited all drugs you build up tolerance to. So eventually that fantasy is going to wear thin. And the pharmacological action of that fantasy, you'll build up tolerance, and eventually it fades out, and you're just stuck with your, own fucked up self, and you haven't quite actualized into this fantastic being that you thought you would. And then you need to put something else in it. Then you need to find something else to sustain you. And I think that's why a lot of people also relapse after many years in that process, because if the fantasy wears off, then you're just stuck in reality, and you've got no means to navigate that, But anyway, I'm digressing. So I'm just saying that I've been speaking to some guys on how to apply that African context worldview within philosophy as a way of life, because the American notion of self-actualization and the self as this encapsulated individual that has got this amazing, that needs to live this meaningful, purposeful life that actualizes towards these higher stages, isn't necessarily applicable, particularly in South Africa. And from a recovery perspective, I'm not quite sure how useful that is, or how helpful that is, or how curative it is. I think initially maybe, but after a while, I think it becomes actually a toxic idea, because it's misguided. It's factually and ontologically incorrect. That's who you are.
Oh, we've been going for 20 minutes. You wanted to speak about something else. Shall I stop the recording?
Yeah, okay. So it's digressing a bit there.
Do you want to say something before I stop the recording?
No, I think that's okay. Thanks.